After the speech by Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev in Shusha and his interview with Reuters, in which the Azerbaijani president expressed perfectly reasonable surprise at Russia's behavior following the destruction of a Russian air defense system by an Azerbaijani passenger airliner and advised Ukraine not to surrender and not to recognize the occupation of its territories by Russian aggressors, Russian pro-war bloggers practically flooded Telegram channels and other social networks with calls for war against Azerbaijan. Russian propagandists are now accusing Azerbaijani special services of helping Ukraine carry out the unprecedented web operation with the assistance of the Azerbaijani diaspora. This operation became a brilliant attack on the military airfields of the Russian Federation, the so-called airfields of death, from which the planes take off on the orders of Russian President Vladimir Putin to kill Ukrainian women and children. We understand perfectly well why these accusations are being made. It's because the Russian cannibal would like to add Azerbaijani women and children to the Ukrainian ones, starting with those Azerbaijanis who are currently on the territory of the Russian Federation and can be repressed with impunity, without fear of a military response from the country that Russia plans to attack. And it is clear that these statements by Russian pro-war bloggers and the information on Russian television channels, ridiculous as they may seem, but quite important in terms of understanding the intentions of the Russian political and military leadership, should not be taken lightly. Such statements always appear when Moscow deems it necessary to begin preparing for a particular military campaign against a hostile state. This is genuine preparation of public opinion. This was the case before the war in Chechnya, when the residents of that republic were portrayed by Russian television channels as little less than demons from hell. The same thing happened before the war against Ukraine, when Russian propagandists spread tall tales about the Ukrainian Maidan and then invented the insane myth that Ukraine had been bombing Donbass for 8 years, a region now reduced to ruins by the efforts of the Russian army and the criminal political leadership of that dreadful country. And something similar is happening now with Azerbaijan. Of course, one could just dismiss the calls from bloggers to attack Azerbaijan and prepare for war with that country. But it's clear that given the level of irrationality in Russia's political leadership, military, and society, every country that shares a border with the Russian Federation must be prepared for any surprises. There is no room for complacency here. Could Russia attack Azerbaijan today? Obviously, at first glance, such an attack does not seem realistic, because almost all of the Russian army's forces are currently focused on occupying Ukrainian cities and villages, killing peaceful Ukrainians, and repressing the population living in territories of Ukraine occupied by Russia. Azerbaijan is not a priority right now. We have seen that Russia practically lacks the capacity to act in any other direction. This was evident from the situation in the South Caucasus. It was also clear from the situation in Syria, where Bashar al-Assad's puppet regime fell primarily because neither Moscow nor Tehran could provide effective assistance to their ally. However, we should not rule out a situation where Putin might consider launching new aggressive military campaigns if there is a ceasefire in Ukraine, if hostilities are suspended, or if some of his troops are freed up, because the Russian president will realize that a massive offensive against Ukrainian positions does not yield any real results. We may assume that Putin will be reluctant to attack Azerbaijan because he does not want to damage his relationship with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who remains an important partner for the Russian president. But will Erdogan remain such a partner in the coming months and years? Especially considering that US President Donald Trump is determined to ensure that countries currently buying Russian oil and other energy resources abandon this form of cooperation with Moscow. And besides, let's not forget the degree of political irrationality of the Russian president, who is convinced that all the former Soviet republics are not real states, but countries with limited sovereignty, and that the leaders of these republics are, so to speak, the first secretaries of the central committees of the Republican Communist parties, who should show proper respect to Putin, the general secretary. The man who sits in the Kremlin today has still not realized that the inglorious history of the Soviet Union, the history of oppression against the peoples who lived in this misanthropic empire, came to an end a long time ago. And what kind of end was it? A shameful end. That's why it's absolutely clear that you can expect surprises from Putin. And I wouldn't just ignore the statements made by his propagandists, especially since in the case of Azerbaijan, it might not be about a full-scale military campaign at all, but for example, about protecting Azerbaijan's national minorities with some kind of squads or militias that could be created in the neighboring republics of the North Caucasus. Fortunately, there are divided peoples who could be united and protected. And we all know very well how Russia is capable of using such arguments to launch aggressive attacks on neighboring countries. After all, it's not just the so-called Russian-speaking population that can be protected. Russia feels quite comfortable playing the role of protector throughout the entire post-Soviet space whenever it needs to carry out some form of aggression. The examples of the so-called Donbas People's Republics or Transnistria, which have been kept under Russian control since the late 1980s and early 1990s, are a very good illustration of how Russian provocations are invented and put into practice. At the same time, it should not be forgotten that Vladimir Putin is not inventing anything new, but is following in the footsteps of his Soviet and Russian predecessors who created a similar provocative backdrop for Russian invasions. Therefore, it is important to keep in mind both the safety of the Azerbaijani diaspora in Russia, which will obviously face difficult times, and the security of Azerbaijan itself after the statements made by that country's president. Thank you, friends. Stay tuned to this channel. Subscribe to it. Follow me on my social media. Make use of Patreon accounts, which help develop and support this project, as well as the sponsorship options available right here on YouTube. Peace to you all.